basically ask the question, what is it that's not being asked? When the researchers go out and look at people who are eating meat and people who are avoiding meat, what kinds of questions are they asking? What kinds of questions are they not asking? And how does that bias the research? And so one obvious one is that if you eat meat or not is a yes or no decision, and how you eat meat is not necessarily a yes or no decision at all. Same thing with eggs. And so if you're going to check the box, do you eat eggs, yes or no? You say, yes, I eat eggs. But there's not a follow-up question that says, well, how do you cook your eggs? And what kind of eggs do you eat? And so one of the things that I've probably talked about quite a bit here is the medical concepts of Dr. Emanuel Ravisi, who I consider to be the brightest medical mind of the last century. And he was born at the turn of the century and died at the end of the century, so on some level he's kind of the epitome of the 20th century medical expert. But one of the things that surprised me was that when he talked about lipids, and he talked about foods that have lipids in them, fats and cholesterol, and specifically about eggs, he said the metabolic character of that food is dramatically different if you cook it or don't cook it. And so when he would say, okay, these foods are alkaline forming, these foods are acid forming, or they're anaerobic and aerobic, or they're anabolic and catabolic, he would put eggs in two different categories depending upon how they were cooked. If they were raw, they were mildly acidifying or neutral, and if they were cooked, even to the edge of being slightly alkalinizing, but if they were cooked, they were definitely acid, massively acid forming. And on looking at it from an inflammatory point of view, eggs go from being pretty much non-inflammatory when they're raw to being highly inflammatory when they're cooked. And so when somebody says eggs are dangerous, I would like to ask the question, are you talking about fried eggs? Are you talking about soft-boiled eggs? Are you talking about raw eggs, hard-boiled eggs? And what's the state of the yolk? And it turns out that that's a critical question. If the yolk is hard, you have the fats in the egg yolk are beginning to go rancid by the cooking process. So you're being exposed to rancid fats, which are mutagens, carcinogens, and teratogens. And they suppress immune system activity. Phagocytes go around eating things, engulfing things. That stops when you have this insult of rancid fat hitting your system. Rancid fat is so dangerous that the taste buds in the throat or in the back of the tongue, when they get stimulated by rancid fat, they make us throw up, so that we get rid of that rancidity before it has a chance to be absorbed and do damage to our system. So there's another aspect to it as well. Ravisi used raw egg yolks as a test for his cancer patients back in 1930, the late 1920s and through the 1930s. He had a cancer treatment clinic in Trafalgar Hospital in New York. This was before he was ostracized by the cancer industry. And he would diagnose the character, the metabolic characters of people's cancer by feeding them a cup of coffee and a raw egg yolk. And so the cup of coffee is a herbal-based alkalinizing agent that would last about 8 to 10 hours. And the egg yolk is a lipid-based alkalinizing agent, which would have a comparable time frame. And he would give this to his newly diagnosed cancer patients who are coming into his clinic, and if their pain got worse, they would have one kind of cancer, and if their pain eased, they would have a different kind of cancer. And when he treated them, he found that that diagnosis was right 90% of the time. So that whole issue of raw egg yolks and it being used as an anabolic challenge, an alkaline challenge, and cooked egg yolks being a strong, powerful acidifying challenge, gave me this insight into food. And when somebody posts this finding on the massive headlines that eating eggs is as dangerous as smoking cigarettes, I ask the question, are they talking about cooked eggs? And it makes perfect sense to me that they would. when you're talking about an inflammatory insult to the human body in a society that has endemic inflammation, I can see how this would be a serious problem, and that this is not a smart thing to do, and it's something that I don't do. I don't eat hard-boiled eggs anymore, except maybe once a week, once a year, if I have a craving for deviled eggs. And but rancid fat from the egg yolk, from the cooked egg yolk, and oxidized cholesterol from the cooked egg yolk pose serious risks to your cardiovascular system. And so the researchers who are studying eggs don't know to ask this question. What kind of eggs do you eat? How do you cook your eggs? Do you eat hard-boiled eggs or not? What percentage of your eggs that you eat are hard-boiled or not? And so what they do is they blend together the people who are eating eggs responsibly and the people who are eating eggs irresponsibly. Regarding meat, you know, they blend together the people who are eating grass-fed beef and the people who are eating moldy grain-fed beef. So the question comes down to the finding, what's the percentage of people who are eating the good, the good versus the bad form? And on the whole, because most Americans are unconscious eaters, they overwhelm the people who are being responsible. So that was the point that I raised on my blog on Google Plus about eating meat, was how do you distinguish between people who are conscious meat eaters who choose to eat meat and are very picky about the kind of meat that they eat, and to separate those from the people who are unconscious meat eaters? And how do you separate people who overeat meat from people who don't overeat meat? And the point that I would caution you is that the researchers don't really ask those kinds of questions. They have to boil it down to a very, very simple, questionnaire-based system, and they also have many times an agenda to only ask the questions that they're interested in, and so the part that they're not interested in, the bias in the system, doesn't actually get fleshed out. They don't collect that kind of data, and so it gets lost. And so there's a minority of people in the United States who are eating eggs consciously, and a minority of people in the United States who are eating meat consciously, and those people should have their health evaluated independently of the people who are eating unconsciously. And so that's one of the empowering aspects of choice, is that when you make a choice and you invest in it, it becomes a placebo response in your health. And if you're unconscious, you're eating, barbecued ribs at a bluegrass festival, and because that's all you've known all your life, you're not making a deliberate choice about it. And so not only are you maybe eating meat that has been fed, rancid grain, and the animal is diabetic when it's killed, but there. Candies. Well, that's the same kind of thing. Grain is a very rich source of carbohydrate, and you can feed the animals expired candy. Any source of sugar will induce diabetes in the animal, and diabetes produces marble fat in the muscle of the animal, which makes it nice and tender, breaks down the connective tissue that makes it easy to chew and easy to digest and easy to cut with a fork. And this is all considered, grade A beef.